My son-in-law laughed at my garden for 3 summers in a row. But the afternoon he called my preserves peasant food, in front of my entire book club, something inside me went very quiet. Not angry quiet. The kind of quiet that means a decision has already been made, even if you haven't said it out loud yet. My name is Dorothy. No, wait! Let me start again, the way things actually began. My name is Iris Calloway. I am 68 years old, and I live in the same house in Guelph, Ontario, where I raised my daughter and watched my husband take his last breath. The house is not large. It has a covered porch that sags slightly on the left side, a backyard that is more garden than grass, and a kitchen that smells like vinegar and cinnamon for most of September, because that is when I put up the preserves. My husband Arthur Calloway passed 4 years ago. He was 69, which felt impossibly young to me then, and still does now. He died on a Tuesday in November, which seems wrong somehow. Arthur was a Tuesday kind of man, only in the sense that he was steady and reliable, and never called attention to himself. He deserved a more dramatic season to go. He would have laughed at that. He laughed at most things, including himself, which is rarer than people think. Arthur worked 40 years as a high school shop teacher in Wellington County. He was the kind of man who fixed other people's lawnmowers without being asked, and remembered every student's name 20 years after graduation. On weekends, he tended the garden with me, not because he had strong opinions about tomatoes, but because he said being beside me was his preferred way to spend a Saturday afternoon. I believed him. I still do. We had 1 child together, our daughter Pauline Calloway. Pauline is 41 now. She lives in a condo in downtown Toronto with her husband, Marcus Webb. They have been married 7 years. Pauline works in communications for a large consulting firm. Marcus works in financial technology, which, as far as I understand it, means he moves money around in ways that require a great deal of confidence and very little explanation. When Pauline was small, she spent every summer afternoon with me in this garden. She could identify any tomato variety by smell before she could read chapter books. She used to drag a little wooden stool to the kitchen counter and stand beside me while I poured hot jam into jars, pressing her nose toward the steam. "Mom," she said once, when she was maybe 7, "your kitchen smells like the best day of the year." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count these past few years. Arthur and I knew from early on that Pauline wanted a life different from the one we gave her. That was never a problem. We were proud of her ambition, her discipline, her willingness to work for what she wanted. She left Guelph for Toronto at 22, and never really came back except for visits. That was fine. That is what children are supposed to do. What I did not anticipate was Marcus. He came into Pauline's life about 8 years ago. Remember the first time she brought him home for Thanksgiving? He arrived in a car that seemed slightly too expensive for a first visit to a girlfriend's parents, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than Arthur's monthly pension. He shook Arthur's hand warmly, looked directly at him while speaking, asked questions about the shop program at the school. I thought, this one is trying. I gave him credit for trying. But I noticed small things even then. The way his eyes moved across our kitchen and registered something before he smiled. The way he declined a second helping and said, very politely, that he was watching his macros. The way he commented that the house had good bones, which is something people say when they want to be kind about a place they find underwhelming. Arthur said nothing about it afterward. He said Marcus seemed like a man who knew what he wanted. I asked if that was a good thing. Arthur smiled into his tea. Depends on what he wants, Nick. He always called me Nick, short for nothing. Just his word for me. After Arthur died, I leaned harder into the things that had always kept me grounded. The garden, the preserves, the Tuesday morning walking group I had belonged to for 11 years. My friend Vera Hutchinson, who has lived 3 houses down since 1998, and who shows up at my door with soup whenever she senses I am struggling, which she seems to sense with remarkable accuracy. And I leaned into Pauline's visits. She came every 6 weeks or so, sometimes with Marcus, sometimes without. When it was just the 2 of us, things felt close to normal. We sat at the kitchen table with tea and talked the way we used to. She helped me plant garlic in October. She asked for the rhubarb jam recipe, even though I had given it to her twice before. When Marcus came, the temperature of things shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough that I started noticing. The first time he commented on the garden, we were standing on the back porch in August. I had put in a new raised bed that summer, growing heritage squash and a climbing bean variety Arthur had always loved. Marcus stood there with his coffee and looked at it the way someone looks at a child's art project. "That's a lot of work for a retired person," he said. I smiled. "I like the work," he nodded. "Have you thought about raised planters? More ergonomic, easier to manage at your age." At your age. I was 64 at the time. I said something like, "I manage just fine, thank you," and he moved on to another topic, but I felt it. That slight rearrangement inside you when someone reduces you to a category without realizing they have done it. The following spring, I gave Pauline 6 jars of my apple butter to take back to Toronto. It was a good batch. I had used the Cortlands from the old tree in the side yard, the one Arthur planted when Pauline was born, and added cardamom the way his mother used to. Pauline texted me when they got home. She said Marcus thought it was sweet that I still did this kind of thing. Sweet that I still did this kind of thing. I read that sentence several times. I am not sure Pauline noticed what it meant. I told myself she probably hadn't. But comments like that kept coming. Small, polite, wrapped in warmth just thick enough to make you feel strange for objecting. One Sunday, Pauline and Marcus came for lunch, and I made a proper pot of beef and barley soup, the kind that takes most of a morning and fills the house with smell that I have always associated with being cared for. Marcus sat down, looked at the bread basket, and said gently, "Do you know how much sodium is in canned barley broth?" I told him I used homemade stock. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not quite convinced. Pauline changed the subject. After they left, I stood at the sink and thought about the soup for a long time. I had been making it since 1987. Arthur had eaten it through 2 knee surgeries and one particularly brutal February, and had never once asked about the sodium content. I told Vera about it on our Tuesday walk. She listened carefully and then said, "He sounds like a man who learned to be condescending in a very educated way." I laughed until my eyes watered. Vera has that gift. The visits continued, and somehow, almost without my noticing, I started adjusting things before Marcus arrived. I stopped putting the bread basket out because he never touched it. I used less butter. I bought a brand of coffee he had mentioned once, which cost twice what I normally spent. I moved my seed catalogs off the kitchen table so the counter would look less cluttered. One afternoon, in early autumn, I was standing in the baking aisle of the grocery store, holding a bag of whole wheat flour, and realized I had been standing there for several minutes because I was trying to remember whether Marcus had said anything negative about whole wheat. I put the flour in my cart. Then I stood there a moment longer, strangely tired. I called Pauline that evening. I did not mention the flour. We talked about her job and a trip she and Marcus were planning to Portugal. She sounded happy. I was glad she sounded happy. But after I hung up, the kitchen felt very quiet in a way it does not usually feel. Vera came by the next morning with a jar of her own crabapple jelly, which is what she does when she thinks I need cheering up without wanting to say so directly. I told her I was fine. She said she knew that. Then she sat down and poured herself a cup of my coffee and said, "You've been making yourself smaller for that man, haven't you?" It was not a question. I did not answer right away, but I also did not disagree. The afternoon it finally broke open was in late September. I had been preparing for my book club all week. 8 women, some of whom I have known for 20 years, meeting the last Friday of every month in rotating houses. That month it was mine. I made 3 things: my grandmother's oat cakes, a wild blueberry compote, and 12 jars of end-of-season tomato jam that I had been putting up since August. I set them on the table with small cloth labels the way I always do. It was, I thought, a very nice spread. Pauline had mentioned she and Marcus would stop by briefly before heading somewhere else that evening. They arrived 45 minutes into the gathering, while the conversation was full and warm, and the oatcakes were already half gone. I introduced Marcus to the women he hadn't met. He was charming. He always is in rooms like that. He made a joke that landed well and accepted a cup of tea. Then his eyes moved across the table and landed on the jam jars. He picked one up, read the label, set it down. Then he smiled at the room and said, "Iris still does all of this by hand. Very old school. The kind of thing you see on lifestyle blogs now." People pretending to be pioneers. No one laughed loudly, but a few people smiled politely in that way. That means they are not sure if something was a joke or not. My friend Louise Abernethy, who has known me since our children were in primary school together, looked at me very carefully. I smiled. Of course I smiled. I always smiled, Marcus continued. He said something about the sugar content of homemade preserves, about how the artisanal food trend was really just nostalgia dressed up as health. He said it pleasantly, the way he said most things, like he was simply offering information. And then, while reaching for a biscuit he hadn't touched a moment before, he added, lightly, almost as an aside, Arthur probably would have lived longer if someone had been monitoring his diet more carefully. The room went still, not completely. The kettle was still clicking in the kitchen. Someone shifted in their chair, but the conversation stopped. Louise set her teacup down. I felt my hand tighten on the jam jar I was holding. Arthur died of a sudden cardiac event. His doctors had told us his heart was quietly defective in a way no diet or lifestyle change would have prevented. Marcus knew this. I had told Pauline. Pauline had told Marcus. I knew she had because I had heard her repeat it to him once on the phone, correcting him when he had made a similar suggestion months before, more gently, in private. This was not a careless mistake. This was something else. Pauline's face had gone the color of milk. Marcus seemed to register that he had miscalculated. He laughed softly, the way people do when they want to reclassify a cruelty as a joke. I was only saying, from a science perspective. Pauline said his name once quietly. He stopped. I did not yell. I did not ask him to leave. I simply set the jar down, excused myself to refill the kettle, and stood in my kitchen alone for a moment, looking at the old tiles above the stove that Arthur and I had chosen together at a salvage yard in 1994. I stood there until I was sure my hands had stopped shaking. After everyone left that evening, Louise stayed behind to help me clear the table. She did not say much. She wrapped the leftover oatcakes in a cloth and placed them in the tin, and then looked at me directly. You know you don't have to keep putting up with that. I know, I said, but I had been saying that to myself for 2 years, and I was still putting up with it. Pauline texted me that night. She said, Marcus felt terrible, that he hadn't meant it the way it came out, that he had a clumsy way of talking about health things and she was sorry. 3 separate messages, each one a little more explanatory than the last. I read them all. I wrote back, I understand. Then I sat at the kitchen table where Arthur and I used to do the crossword on Sunday mornings and I let myself cry. Not for long, but properly the kind that has weight to it, because it was not the comment about Arthur that broke something in me. It was the recognition that I had been bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes for years to avoid exactly that kind of moment. And it had happened anyway. And somehow, the sadness of that, all that quiet accommodation, all those second-guessed flour purchases, all those recipe adjustments and cleared counters and held-back responses, felt heavier than the cruelty itself. The next morning I called Pauline. Not to argue, to say something I should have said a long time ago. Pauline, I said, I love you, and I need you to understand that I will not be spoken to like that in my own home again. There was a long pause. Then she said, Mom, I know he went too far, I said. This was not the first time. It was just the first time other people were in the room. Another silence. I don't want you to feel like you have to choose sides, I said. But I also don't want to spend every visit to my own house worrying about what Marcus will say next. She said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, I think that starts with him. She didn't answer right away. 2 weeks later, Pauline came alone. No call ahead, no explanation. Just her car in the driveway on a Saturday morning, and her standing at the back door with a bag from the Guelph Farmers Market, including, I noticed, a jar of someone else's jam. I let her in. We sat at the table. She put the farmer's market bag between us like a small offering. She said, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think I've been asking you to make too much room for him and not enough for yourself. I looked at my hands around my tea mug. I said, I think that's right. She said, he grew up in a family where criticizing things was how they showed intelligence. I'm not excusing it, I'm just trying to understand it, I said. Understanding it is different from accepting it. She nodded slowly. That's fair. We sat quietly for a while. Outside, a late-season bee was working the last of the nasturtiums along the fence. Arthur had always loved nasturtiums. He used to eat them in his salads and act like it was an outrageous thing to do. Pauline finally said, "I didn't realize how much he was doing it until you named it." I looked up at her. "You were there for most of it." "I know," she said. "I kept thinking, if I smoothed it over fast enough, it wouldn't settle. I think I was wrong about that." I appreciated her saying that more than I expected to. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was honest, and honesty between us had started to feel like something we were tiptoeing around. Marcus did not come that day, or the following Sunday. Pauline came alone both times. We did not talk extensively about him. We planted the garlic for spring. I taught her the right way to seal a jar so the lid clicks properly, which I had apparently never explained in sufficient detail, despite 30 years of putting up preserves beside her. She laughed at that. So did I. On the second Sunday without Marcus, Vera came over in the afternoon, and the three of us sat on the porch with tea and the last of the apple butter. Vera had never been able to tolerate Marcus and had made no attempt to hide this, which I had always found both alarming and deeply comforting. Pauline said to Vera, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Vera said, "You saw it. Seeing it and acting on it are two different muscles. Takes practice." That made Pauline quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. About a month after the book club afternoon, I received an email from Marcus. Not a phone call, not a visit. An email, which told me something about how he processed accountability. At a safe distance, and in a format he could revise before sending. It was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that his comment about Arthur had been wrong. The second explained that he had been raised in a household where bluntness was considered a virtue, and that he had not always understood how it landed on other people. The third said he hoped we could move forward. It was not a perfect apology. There was a lot of explaining alongside the acknowledging, but there was something in it that felt real, or at least like a first attempt at real. I sat with it for 2 days before I replied. Then I wrote back simply, "Thank you for writing this. I'd like to move forward too. But I need things to be different at my house." He wrote back 1 line, "I understand, I'll work on it." Whether he meant it, I did not know yet. You cannot know a thing like that until time tells you. What I did know was something I had not expected to discover through all of this. Somewhere in the months of adjusting recipes and clearing counters, and swallowing comments, I had started to lose track of who I was in my own kitchen. I had begun to measure my home through someone else's eyes, and that slow disappearance had happened so quietly that I had almost convinced myself it wasn't happening at all. After Pauline's second Sunday visit, I went through the house room by room and put things back where they belonged. The seed catalogs went back on the kitchen table. The good bread tin went back on the counter. I made a full pot of beef and barley soup and left it on the stove for 2 days and ate it for every meal and did not think once about the sodium. I called Vera and told her what I had done. She said, "About time." I laughed. It really was. The following Saturday, I was at the farmer's market when I ran into a woman named Carol Sims, who had been in the same canning course as me back in 2009. We had not spoken in years. She stopped when she saw my basket, which was full of late harvest apples, and said, "Are you still doing your preserves?" "I am," I told her. She grabbed my arm. "My daughter made your black currant jam from a recipe you gave her at that course. She still makes it every summer. She says it tastes like being taken care of." I stood there in the middle of the market for a moment with my basket of apples and thought about that sentence. It tastes like being taken care of. That is what I had been trying to explain, in various ways, for years, to someone who was not interested in hearing it. Food is not just nutrition. A jar of jam sealed in August is not just sugar and fruit. It is the intention behind it, the time, the choice to do something slowly and carefully for someone you love, in a world that moves very fast and rewards very little that is slow or careful. Marcus did not understand that yet. He might someday, he might not. But I understood it. I had always understood it. I had just forgotten for a while that my understanding was worth something. The first time Marcus came back to my house, he arrived with Pauline on a Sunday in late November, carrying a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a small jar of preserves he had apparently made himself from a kit Pauline had bought him. He held it out at the door with an expression that I can only describe as someone who is trying very hard and is not sure how it is going to be received. The jar was crooked. The seal was slightly uneven. The label was handwritten and a bit smeared. I took it from him and looked at it properly. "Crabapple," he said. "I think." The kit was not very clear on the varieties. I turned it over in my hands. "Did you process it in a hot water bath?" He blinked. "There was supposed to be a hot water bath." I told him there was supposed to be a hot water bath. I told him we would need to keep it refrigerated and use it within 2 weeks. He looked at Pauline. She said, "I told you to read the second pamphlet," he said. There was a second pamphlet. I stood back from the door. "Come in," I said. "I'll show you how to do it properly." He came in. He stood in my kitchen for the first time without looking around it with that measuring quality in his eyes. He stood there like someone who was paying attention to something he had not paid attention to before. We did not fix everything that afternoon. Things like this do not get fixed in an afternoon. But he asked questions he had never asked before, about the canning process, about why I grew heritage varieties rather than the ones at the grocery store, about which of Arthur's recipes I still used, and what it felt like to cook them now. That last question surprised me most. I told him it felt like a conversation I was still having, like Arthur was still on the other side of the table, asking what's cooking. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good way to hold on to someone." It was the most human thing I had ever heard him say. Pauline looked at me over his head with an expression that was somewhere between relief and exhaustion. I understood both. After dinner, while Pauline helped me wash up, she said quietly, "Thank you for giving him a chance." I handed her a dish to dry. I said, "He has to earn it, but he showed up. That's the beginning." She nodded. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down across the backyard, soft and even, covering the garden beds I had put to sleep for winter. The old apple tree in the side yard stood bare. Arthur planted it the year Pauline was born, which means it is 41 years old now, the same age as my daughter. It survives every winter and comes back every spring without any help from anyone, which I have always found privately comforting. Later that night, after they had gone and the house was quiet, I stood at the kitchen window with my hands around a cup of tea and looked out at the tree in the dark. I thought about what Vera had said months ago now. "You've been making yourself smaller for that man, haven't you?" I had. For longer than I wanted to admit, and somewhere in the effort of trying to keep peace, I had started to mistake peace for safety. They are not the same thing. Peace without honesty is just silence dressed up. And silence, I had learned, does not protect you. It only makes the walls thinner. What protected me, in the end, was simply deciding I was worth protecting. That sounds more straightforward than it felt. It never feels straightforward when you are in the middle of it, when the person hurting you is someone your child loves, when every confrontation risks a fracture you cannot predict. It is slow and uncertain, and some days you still wonder if you handled it right. But I know this. I am standing in my kitchen. The seed catalogs are on the table. The bread tin is on the counter. The preserves are lined up in the cellar, 43 jars of them, apple butter and rhubarb and tomato and black currant, each one sealed and labeled in my own handwriting. And when I stand here now, I do not hear Marcus's voice in my head. I hear Arthur's. "What's cooking, Nick?" Everything, I tell him. Everything it should be.